My friends, this is John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8, I think. I'm thinking about changing the name of the channel. I don't have any good ideas, and I'm extremely frustrated because I sort of fancy myself to be a creative person. I've invented no less than 8 neologisms, of which are at the very heart of the self-made encyclopedia that I have been writing for a long time now. And yet, when it comes to coming up with a name for the channel that I have right here, Circle 8 certainly resonated with me as being a perfect depiction of the very thing that I was doing, especially because there were 8 elements to this encyclopedic effort that I have called the Architext. The Architext is an idiosyncratic, self-made, exploratory encyclopedia that's actually a memoir, the first memoir written in the form of an encyclopedia. And you might can think of it as being a series of lines or threads in thinking held together by holes in unintelligibility. There's a sense in which it is itself a form of bricolage. It is a self-made DIY encyclopedia capturing my own jewels and gems and gleanings from delving into the Western tradition with books and art, but also the very pursuit of wisdom and the very pursuit of the things that we think of as having been answered, the questions that we think of as having a certain kind of absurdity, I have found to have secret doors within themselves, and that in many ways this pursuit of philosophy is made up of various kinds of exits and secret entrances and secret passages out and trap doors. And so in many ways, a lot of what I do in pursuing philosophy is very much an expression of that circularity. My thought is inherently circuitous. And because there were 8, I thought, hey, Circle 8, circulate. But my best friends, they all hate it. And I love my best friends because they're all skeptical. But on a certain level, they know what they don't like. But what they don't have is something better. I had considered Socrates, with whom the philosophers of ancient Greece had called atopos. That means unclassifiable. Atopos means without category. So I'd imagined I might reimagine Circle 8 as atopos. And yet even that falls on deaf ears. Atopos apparently only speaks to the specifically intellectual, the specific type who knows a certain amount about Greek thinking to know what that would mean. That sort of put out the flame. So I'm in a state of despair. And in despair, I'm asking for help. Does anyone have a better name for what I'm doing? Something better than atopos, something better than Circle 8. The other name that was proposed is in lieu of one of my passion projects, which is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson had composed her poems in what she had called fascicles. She left behind her poems in these self-created collections called fascicles. And so my other friend had proposed that I call my channel the Fascicle, but no one agrees. So what am I to say? Out of sheer stubbornness, out of sheer desire to get over it, I'm thinking about just leaving the name Circle 8 because it still speaks to me. But I don't want to be without an audience. I don't want to live without an audience. So I think that not only what I'm looking for is a better name, but also serious criticisms about what I'm doing and also creative ideas about what I should be doing, because I'm probably missing the obvious. A part of being philosophical or even thinking at all means missing the obvious. So fill me in. That's why I'm doing this. What should I do? I know that I should be making videos that are like 7 minutes to 10 minutes, and I should be on point. I should be clear and concise, almost like Aristotle and Descartes should be the very models within which I am thinking and speaking. But more than that, I should have an advertising styled model where I'm making the form as powerful as I know the content to be. My very idea is that I'm going to bring philosophy to life. I really think of myself as being a vehicle through which this very thing is moving. And I want to have a form online that allows me to transmute, to translate the very things that I have been doing mentally for a long time, both in form and content. I mean, given what I've said already about my own creation of this thing called the Architext, I've also been passionately interested in fundamental text, like not only in philosophy, but in literature and history, economics and science. I've always been as interested in Ptolemy and Euclid as Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton. I know it sounds stupid, but I remember sitting at Burger King trying as best as I could to understand Einstein. I think there's a certain beauty in the naivety of that approach, because what I ultimately learned through my own amateur attempt to understand Einstein wasn't that I knew anything. I didn't learn anything, but I really discovered how much all of the charlatans out there, how much all of the pseudoscientists don't know, because I knew what I didn't know, and I could tell that their own gleanings failed to even come close to what I discovered in trying to pull myself up by my bootstraps to read these fundamental texts in science. And that also means trying to understand something about science as a whole. And that also is in coherence with a desire to read the great books in history, that is, in Thucydides and Herodotus, but also the sense in which there's a tension within modern thinking between what's called the new historicism, which occurs in the 60s, which is a critical theorist in many different things, many different ways, a critical theory attempt to rewrite and rethink history, not in merely a negative way, but also in a way that represents another way of thinking about history that is up against the more classical or more humanistic representations of history. I include them all in my own pursuit of attempting to swallow whole the greatness of the Western philosophical tradition. But also I wanted to read outside of that, and I wanted to look at great art. And so Peter Paul Rubens, as a random example, as well as Michelangelo and the greatness of Greek ceramics, the greatness of Greek sculpture, but also the invention of the stage with Aeschylus and Sophocles in ancient Greece, and the ways in which opera, which is one of my more recent passions, Italian opera, that in itself, along with literature and stage dramas that emerge in Tudor and Stuart England and the English Renaissance. All of that has been something that I have never been afraid to jump into and see what I could pull from it. Because as I mentioned from time to time, sort of tongue in cheek, is that, I have an 8th grade education. I only made it through high school because I had beautiful teachers who in many ways felt bad for me, and they knew that I really just needed to get through and get out of there and into the world. And so bless their heart. But I'm not suffering from any illusions about my lack of specialty, my lack of expertise, my lack of any real certificate or any sort of title or any sort of authority. The authority I begin with is the same authority I think that all authority begins with, which is almost arbitrary. So in other words, to be an author, which is related to the word authority, that in itself is almost arbitrary. In other words, you don't have to have a title or a degree to be an author. Even to speak poetically, you don't have to have a degree in poetry. And so I think that there's a certain reclaiming, a certain reassimilation of poetry and philosophy in everyday life that is fundamental to reclaiming what it has to offer us. The depths of poetry go beyond formal poetry or learning how to read a sonnet or a ballad or a villanelle. What it means is seeing that poetry in everyday life is a way of reimagining life, not in a fantastical, crazy way, but as a way of reconnected to aesthesis, that is the senses, that is allowing poetry into your life, not merely as a way of reading it and forgetting about it, but allowing the poetical element into your language and into your sensibilities as a way of reconnecting with aesthesis in the form of the senses, of the sensory, in the sense that, I say that too often in the sense that, but one has to recognize the ways that, although capitalism might not be the worst thing in the world, it probably is, but the worst thing that it has done has to make our language so managerial, so instrumental, so focused on thinking in a certain way that might be powerful in a certain way, but it is completely overlooked and sort of bowled over and destroyed what in many ways a freer, more expansive kind of language might allow you. So this isn't just about philosophy. I've always loved poetry along with philosophy, and it's no coincidence, it's not a mere coinkydink that philosophy itself 2,500 years ago or so begins with a kind of tension, a kind of wrestling with poetry, because the philosophers of Plato and Aristotle and others are emerging with a backdrop, which is the Homeric and other Greek epics, the Greek mythology, which is told in song, it's told in poetry. And Plato himself initiates philosophy by initiating a kind of refusal of poetry. He's sort of refuting Sophocles and Aeschylus. And yet he was not afraid. Plato's greatness is that he wasn't afraid to leave what appears to be Socrates speaking freely, his own representation of his character Socrates, who was a real person, but he seems to capture what Socrates may have been really thinking, which is this open wondering as to whether or not he shouldn't have been singing all along. It's one of the more remarkable moments in Plato's dialogues, when Socrates, in spite of all of his philosophizing, in spite of all of his attempts to find the truth and to speak the truth and to make it clear, he wonders at a certain point whether or not he shouldn't have been singing all along. I find that to be so touching, because philosophy has never really escaped this underlying profundity that exists in the poetical. But this isn't poetry as we imagine it and as we teach it, although there's so much to be gained from that. What this means is imagining poetry as having something to do with the mythological, not only as a way of reanimating and retouching the world, but through the senses, but also as a way of reclaiming what the dominant images, what the dominant paradigms, what the dominant forces and stories that we're telling ourselves, that those are related to the poetical. And when we can not only think of our language as reanimating the poetry and beauty and the playful moments in our life, but it's not merely harmless, because in doing this, in conjunction with philosophy, what you're actually doing is touching into something that I really think changes lives. I'm not a person that believes that lives can be changed. I don't have any illusions about that. I'm not the kind of person who believes that there are shortcuts or magic pills or any easy solutions regarding how you change your life. I believe in the hard path. I think that you have to look truth directly at it as it is, and you have to go into it. And that actually means that you're doing the hardest things possible. You're putting the hardest demands on yourself. You're actually doing what other people aren't doing when they're trying to make their life easier. I mean, bless their hearts, most people are trying to make their life easier. But when you're pursuing the philosophical life, you're intentionally making things harder on yourself. You're taking on something that is actually absurd, because you're taking the hard road home. In other words, you're taking the hard path, which is the path to truth. It's a path that demands a kind of courage in yourself that in our society you can easily let go of. Our society doesn't require any courage at all. But this courage isn't merely physical. It demands that you have the courage to go into yourself. As Emily Dickinson had said, my wars are laid away in books, right? My wars are laid away in books. Another poet, W.B. Yeats, had said that it takes more courage to go into yourself than it does for a soldier to fight on the battlefield. Now, having known soldiers, real soldiers in my life, I could say that he might be mistaken in that respect, because I don't have that kind of courage to go into actual battle myself. And even as a failed anarchist, I never really had that courage to pull the trigger myself, so to speak, if you know what I mean. But what I mean to say is that the very power, the very thing that you discover in taking this hard path into yourself, that is philosophy, that I'm here speaking about in relation to poetry. It's no wonder that I mentioned W.B. Yeats and I mentioned Emily Dickinson, because what you're going into isn't merely the harmless ability to reclaim poetry in your life. What you're doing is realizing that at the heart of your life isn't reality itself, but in many ways an image that is helping you make sense of your experiences. And it's not an image in an artificial, superficial sense. It's an image that is like what they call a paradigm, or a paradigm or whatever you want to say. Like there's an archetypal center to your thinking that's like an organizing principle. And I'm not saying that you're not connected to reality and you don't see things as they are, but the way that you orient the whole of your life, holistically, synoptically, or I say holistic because there's a sense that Gestalt, what's called Gestalt, which is the way that we make sense of the totality of the specifics in our life, of the specificity of our experience. The way that we organize that in our minds is by using our imagination. Our imagination is used philosophically here. So the imagination is not mere fantasy, but the imagination has to do with the stories that we're telling. And there's a great book called Sapiens by a writer named Harari. And Sapiens is a really great book that, in the sense, is great because it is attempting to be simplistic, and being simplistic makes you guilty of a lot of limitations that he's been called out for. But I think you should overlook that, because this book is really teasing out the ways in which our entire society, in the way that power is formed, is through the stories that on level and layer after layer within what we're doing are organized based on these imaginary principles that we've agreed to tell one another about what life is, about what nature is, civilization and culture itself. Not to sound too intellectual, but going back as far as human civilization begins, has to do with these imaginative stories that we told ourselves. And they're actually really incredible, really powerful. Like the story of credit. Like credit, which makes up the totality of our financial institutions that are running our world and creating all the problems that we have. These financial institutions are made up of power. Real power that's separate from the stories that we're telling ourselves. They have nothing to do with what's going on in media, mostly, or in Hollywood, mostly. These stories have nothing to do with the lives that we're even living when we're protesting and living our little activist lives online or in real life. All of this power is actually made up of something that has to do with something else, that has to do with the imagination. It's real, but it has to do with the stories that go back in our history to the emergence of a bourgeois mercantile culture that invents credit as a way of basically creating a kind of power that has never been seen before. So the invention of the credit industries in Amsterdam, and then in England and France and other parts of the world, created something that, in spite of criticism of it, you have to begin with a reverence or an awe about what had happened, because it made the world what it is. And I'm not speaking morally, I'm not even speaking politically. I don't want you to pin me down with what I'm saying, because what I'm trying to suggest is that this imaginative power is so deep in us, and it's so powerful, and you can only criticize parts of it. But it is in fact made up of stories that we're telling ourselves about what counts as property. Property itself, or what counts as, you want to talk about like social constructions, like gender is a social construction. No matter what you think about it, you can go either way, but it also demands recognizing that thinking of yourself as a person, as a self, as having an identity, that in itself is a social construction that goes back a long time. And the only way that you can only tap into criticizing it or reshaping it, because that's what I'm getting at, is reshaping this stuff, is taking the intellectual effort, that is taking on the fucking hard work of reading books deeply and thinking deeply, so that you can audit. You can audit in a way where you're going through in a serious way on your own, demanding for your own requirements, seeing for yourself whether or not these things are even justifiable. It doesn't merely mean reading the books, because a part of what I want to do in Circle 8 is to actually read these things in terms of human experience, because I really think that experience itself is what we overlook over and over and over. And I'm not trying to be schoolmarmish or pedantic, but I think that individually people, in spite of whether or not they might even think this in what they say, because what they say and are isn't really the same thing as really seeing that your experience is the starting point from which you should be judging all of these books and all of these ideas that you might already believe. And so I think of Circle 8 in many ways as being an exploration of that. But you can see that I can't help but getting carried away, right? And over time, I'm allowing myself to get carried away, because baby, that's what I do. Like, I let my hair down because I'm Baroque. I have a Baroque heart. My heart is like a cathedral. And what I mean is that I find significance not only in what I'm saying, but in the act of saying it. So I'm not gonna hide the fact that I love the sound of my own voice. And I sort of listen to my own recordings. I listen to these recordings in the way that Prince once said that when he wanted to hear new music, when Prince wanted to hear new music, he said that he would make it himself. When I heard that, like, there was no looking back. And so it's no wonder that as a lifelong podcast listener, I sort of now have a penchant for listening to myself, for listening to these recordings. So I think that that's what I mean by being Baroque. I mean that in regards also to G.K. Chesterton, the great British writer who had a lot to say about the ways in which significance itself can be rediscovered, and allowing yourself to give in to the kind of playfulness, to the kind of shaggy dogness, to the kind of thing that we sort of sometimes hear in other people, like in a derogatory way. It's sort of something that people see the Irish as doing. And I happen to have an Irish side of my family that like has a gift for gab, and they just give in to like stories and talking. And some people see that as like artificial, but it is on one level, but it's also like where the very juice of life is at, right? And it can be sort of superficial, but it's also a way of investigating the very deepness and complexity of human life, because that demands a certain drama, a certain like ability to play, to let go. And I think it's no wonder, I don't know, maybe I'm being derogatory or reductive, but I think the Irish have something in common with the Italians. And I'm sort of fascinated with Italian culture, Italian people, with opera and all of that, because in a certain level, what I'm doing philosophically is like opera. You know, and so it's beautiful that I'm able to capture all of this, because I have endless recordings that go on for a long time, where in many ways I've already practiced a lot of even these little things. But what I'm trying to say, my friends, I meant to make a 7-minute long video. I promised myself I would make a 7-minute long video about whether or not I should change the name Circle 8. But Circle 8, and the last thing that I'm going to say, is trying to capture this thing that I've been getting at, which is that philosophically, you're challenging your underlying assumptions and beliefs in what we do with philosophy. We're also challenging society's assumptions and beliefs, those tacit, hidden ideas that people don't know they have, and that society it runs by. And these are partially imaginary, but in philosophy, they're arguments and ideas. And that means that when you challenge them, it's not that you become a different person, but you reorient, reconstitute yourself by challenging these images that make up the stories you're telling yourself, that are also arguments. Like, philosophy's like brilliance is its ability to see that these things are kind of arguments. They're not always arguments, but what we are is partially made up of beliefs that are semi-conscious to us, but underneath these beliefs, there are other beliefs that we don't always realize we have. Like, smart people are often aware of, like, they're self-aware to know that they have beliefs beneath these beliefs. But what philosophers discover is that even beneath these beliefs, there's sort of like layers within us. And it's not like we could go all the way down. But what we sort of discover is that there are what are called axiomatic principles, or centering mythologies, or organizing principles that sort of make up our beliefs and make up what society's beliefs are. And so whenever you're thinking philosophically, you're sort of partially analytically deconstructing like these ideas. But I really believe that what you're also doing is remaking yourself. A part of what I do in Circle 8 is wanting to emphasize something I think gets left out of colleges, and it gets left out of a lot of philosophical skepticism, which is that we wake up in the next morning in wreckage, right? We wake up with a lot of broken pieces. There's no certainty. We can't believe stories. Almost everything we believe is false. If you're philosophically skeptical, nothing is believable, right? So you wake up the next day, and what are you doing? Well, that's where I think that philosophy has something to learn from music and from poetry. And that's what I'm trying to get at in this. And it almost has nothing to do with Circle 8, except that it is the very thing that's operating within Circle 8. Because what I think we're doing is that we're giving ourselves the best opportunity to be reborn. And ever since I discovered the Renaissance, when I was like 17 years old, when I fell in love with Leonardo da Vinci and The Lives of the Philosophers, which is a book written by a Florentine named Giorgio Vasari. And in Lives of the Philosophers, he sort of describes Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, he gets a lot of it wrong, but he creates a beautiful panorama of all these other Florentine philosophers and painters mostly. And what I discovered in the Renaissance was the idea of rebirth. And I wasn't even really aware of Christianity. I was lucky enough to not have any religious training or experience. So when I heard Giorgio Vasari talking about the Renaissance, or Rinascimento, whatever it's called in Italian, he described it as being a rebirth of the spirit, right? So I saw a rebirth, the ability we have to be reborn, as being a possibility that I had even at 16, and that was before I even knew about philosophy. And so I saw, or I sort of intimated, this idea that I could let go of the darkness in myself, because my own 16-year-old mind, I was very naive, very wet behind the ears. I associated that with my own dark ages. Like, I associated what the Renaissance was, which is a 14th, 15th century Italian movement that isn't just in art, it's also in culture and in the humanities. It's a rebirth of science, it's a rebirth of democracy and republics. And what I sensed, though, was a personal connection to my own darkness, which I haven't spoken about in these videos because I've sort of gotten so far beyond it that I don't even remember who I used to be. But I sort of, at that age, connected the Dark Ages, which is a long period in human history that we sort of misunderstand, because it's not even a dark age. Like, that's a misunderstanding of it. But that's besides the point, because I saw myself as being able to be somehow reborn in life, like reinvented. And there's some clear connections to a lot of what's going on in every person's life at that time. And when you're a teenager, you really want to be reborn. And I think that there's a connection between a lot of things that are going on in our society, with a lot of the troubles and heartbreaking things that are happening with young people in rural areas and cities and in the suburbs. No matter where you go, there's this self-destructive streak that is extremely bleak. And I think philosophy has something to say about that, except that it actually demands doing the opposite of what everybody's doing. Because although you need medications, and although you need shortcuts and you need help, I think that the help you need is actually to make your life more difficult. Like when you're a teenager, on a certain level, you have to, no matter what age you are, to actually improve your life, you have to ignore what everybody is telling you to do and do what is hardest, which isn't even doing philosophy, because what I'm asking is to do philosophy as a way of finding the best actual opportunity you have to be reborn as a person. And that's a secular way of thinking about what is really a Christian ideal. It goes back to Plato. But I think that what I later discovered in another Renaissance thinker, which is Michel de Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne wrote essays, and he has a lot in common with the Florentines, in the sense that he sort of had a capacity for rebirth that ties in to this idea that a person can let die within themselves what is superstitious, what is false, what is ignorant, what is really like believing in dragons. It's really like believing in things that are false. Now, I'm not prescribing rationalism, and I'm not prescribing reason. I'm not prescribing any of that. I'm prescribing a clear advocacy of human nature. That you begin with the human brain, you begin with us as bodies, and then you think from that. So I'm advocating a kind of, at best, inductive reasoning that begins with your own experience. But that makes it even harder to imagine like what I'm meaning to say, because that's a secular point of view. And yet I think that even our secular point of view is organized not only in a social way and in a way that we are organized in that we carry the social. And the only thing that really matters, in fact, because what I'm trying to get at is that individually, in an autonomous way, philosophy and poetry together allow you to simultaneously take apart who you are, your ideas, but also the stories that you have. And it allows you the best option you have to reanimate the images, to remake within yourself the stories by using poetry, by using the deepest sense of what the mythological means, of what taking control of language means. That in itself is what it means to find your way back into the senses, because it's always within me this urgent existential recognition that philosophy in itself, as it's taught, philosophy has failed. Like, it's not working. But I'm already philosophical, so there's no escaping this. Like, I'm already philosophical. But I'm beginning with the wreckage. I'm beginning with the post-Derridian era. Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. I begin with a post-Derridian sense that we are beginning with the wreckage. And I begin with Heidegger and Wittgenstein. I hate to bring up those names, but that means beginning with a certain wreckage, a certain bleakness that means recognizing the truth that the narratives no longer work. And I don't think even the narratives that are a part of my personal opinions are relevant, because I subscribe to the radical democracy of Walt Whitman and W.E.B. Du Bois. And yet I don't think that has any connection to the political. I think that has more to do with a personal affinity. So what I begin with is T.S. Eliot and his Wasteland. And I am already optimistic inherently, because that's a part of what I am. But I don't begin with any illusions about where we're at. I think that we have to begin with our personal need to reconstitute a story and to tell ourselves the best truth that we can. And I also think that we have to be honest, and that means taking the hard path. That's why I go back to that. And that's why Circle 8 in itself and its fundamental insistence upon thinking in an improvised way. That's why I am thinking and speaking and making videos in the way that I am, because I'm really wanting to not do what other philosophers out there are doing online. I mean, some of them are doing what I want to do, but I think that in writing and in the way that they're teaching philosophy and the way they're doing it, in spite of everything that I learned from 20 years of listening to lectures and podcasts, they're not really allowing themselves to be as vulnerable and exploratory and urgent and personal as they could. I'm speaking from the heart, but I'm also speaking about abstract philosophical things. And I think that demand in itself makes a person rather messy. It makes a person rather vulnerable. And I also subscribe to what in an early video I called the boomerang theory, which is that it's okay to lose yourself in thinking, because even in losing your train of thought and losing where you're going in thinking, boomerangs do always come back. And that's again why I call this Circle 8. I guess I'm making my best pitch that I can for Circle 8, but I'm hoping that you all can sort of let me know, not only my first question, should I drop the name and start with something else? Or should I stick with Circle 8? A part of me is just simply wanting to keep going with this. And the other thing is, what kind of videos should I make? Given everything that I said, if you're even at all listening at this point, what kind of videos should I make? Just tell me what I'm doing wrong. Give me your feedback. My feelings won't be hurt, and I'm gonna go from there. So thank you so much. I'm John Edward Willie. This is Circle 8, and this is a gorgeous finish to my video. I love you guys.